The Empire's voice came not as a request but as a declaration, transmitted in flawless, calculated tones across every network humanity possessed. It promised integration into the thousand-world concord. In truth, it was ownership. Every species before us had heard the same offer, an ultimatum dressed in ceremonial grandeur, and every one of them had yielded. They spoke of tribute as if it were tradition, a fifth of our resources, a portion of our children for cultural exchange, and genetic compliance to eliminate undesirable traits. No one had refused them in centuries. The last world that tried was now a poison husk drifting in the shadow of a collapsed sun, preserved as a warning. The day their fleet arrived, the sky became a lattice of silver arcs and burning contrails. From orbit, their warships hung like indifferent gods. On the open channels, the Viceroy's voice was the only sound. No flourish, no threat, just inevitability, kneel, or be unmade. They waited for the answer, certain it would be the same one they always received. Empires feed on patterns, and they had measured the galaxy in predictable surrender. They believed fear was universal, that survival was the highest instinct, that no rational species would choose destruction over obedience. They did not understand humans. The reply came in a voice that was calm, almost cold, as if it belonged to someone reading a fact from a page. No. That single word was carried on every frequency, translated into every known tongue, preserved in the static of deep space. It was not shouted, it was not roared, there was no theater to it. It was a refusal so stark it cut clean through the Empire's presumption of inevitability. In that instant, the galaxy shifted. On worlds bound by chains of tradition, the words sparked disbelief. On conquered colonies, it became a dangerous whisper. Among the Empire's governors, it was an impossibility, like gravity deciding to work in reverse. The Viceroy answered the way empires always do when defied, by preparing annihilation. Their ships began to move in coordinated arcs, shields blooming open, weapons aligning with mechanical precision. To them, the battle was already over. It would be another clean lesson to display to the rest of the galaxy. They thought they had measured us fully. But we had measured them too. We had studied their arrival, mapped their fleet formations, and noted the subtle arrogance in their every maneuver. Empires that have not known true resistance for centuries forget how to adapt. Their discipline was perfect, their procedures flawless, and that was their flaw. Across Earth's networks, there was no panic. Cities were not abandoned, they were fortified. Factories doubled output not for evacuation craft but for weapons and shielding. In the quiet of command rooms, human planners spoke in clipped, unshaken tones. Our species had never been united before, not like this. But the Empire's demand had been the one thing to make every border vanish. The galaxy believed the Empire's victory was a matter of hours. They were wrong, but not because we possessed greater numbers or superior technology. We were outmatched in every measurable way. What they had not accounted for was that humans fight past the point of reason, past the point of survival, past the point where victory even matters. We carry history in our bones, the long memory of standing against things that should have crushed us. Somewhere deep in the Imperial flagship, the Viceroy recorded a formal declaration of conquest. It would never be played. In its place, the first shots of the war lit the upper atmosphere like molten threads weaving a new future. No one in the galaxy had heard a true refusal in living memory. They would hear it again. Not in words this time, but in the silence where the Empire's certainty used to be. Earth had given its answer. And in the quiet before the next strike, the stars themselves seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what would follow a single, unshaken no. The Empire's first strike was meant to be decisive. Orbital bombardment protocols were executed with mathematical precision, targeting military installations, communication hubs, and industrial centers. They expected panic, fragmentation, and rapid collapse. Instead, they found resistance embedded in every layer of the defense grid. Earth's counterstrike was immediate. They had calculated that our inferior technology would prevent us from surviving even a single coordinated assault. What they had not anticipated was the way we had spent the years before contact, scanning, learning, dissecting every fragment of their transmissions, every movement of their ships, every possible flaw in their systems. We had no illusions about matching them gun for gun, but we understood how to turn small advantages into lethal ones. When their lead destroyers entered low orbit, they encountered a wall of interference. Our engineers had weaponized their own signal protocols against them, feeding false telemetry into their navigation arrays. Entire firing solutions were corrupted before they could be executed. By the time they realized the error, railgun emplacements hidden in abandoned infrastructure had already opened fire, striking with brutal accuracy. This was not a war of fleets meeting in open battle. Humanity fought in fragments, small, mobile units launching targeted strikes, vanishing before counterfire could find them. We used the debris of their own destroyed vessels as improvised minefields, seeded into orbits we knew their automated supply craft would follow. Every hour, they lost more than they gained. The Empire's commanders had trained to crush resistance, not to hunt ghosts. They found themselves fighting an enemy that did not present a clear front, that seemed to appear everywhere at once. Surveillance drones were blinded by electromagnetic bursts. Boarding parties sent to secure key sites found themselves walking into traps, narrow corridors rigged to collapse, automated defense turrets reprogrammed to recognize Imperial biosigns as hostile. Human history had prepared us for this. We had fought on every terrain imaginable, from frozen tundra to dense urban sprawls. The Empire's warriors were bred for controlled environments, predictable engagements. They were unused to enemies who fought with the singular goal of disruption rather than territorial gain. We denied them every easy victory, forcing them to spend resources far beyond what their initial campaign budget had projected. And while they bled momentum, something else began to happen. Out on the periphery of Imperial space, the news spread, rumors of a species that had defied the Concorde and survived the first blow. In the mining colonies of the Thasian Belt, workers sabotaged their own production quotas in silent protest. In the markets of the vaster trade worlds, dockworkers turned away Imperial ships under pretense of quarantine. The effect was small at first, a ripple rather than a wave, but it was enough to draw the Empire's attention away from Earth, fracturing their focus. Our psychological warfare deepened that fracture. Cultural broadcasts began to infiltrate their civilian networks, music without translation, images of human gatherings, and fragments of our history's fiercest stands. The intent was not persuasion but infection. Ideas embedded themselves in places the Empire could not easily purge. They had built their dominion on control of information, and we had just shown the galaxy that information could be stolen, twisted, and repurposed. The first prisoner we took was an Imperial captain whose ship had been disabled in an ambush near the Jovian moons. He was not defiant in captivity, he was bewildered. In interrogation, he admitted that they had expected us to crumble within a day. His final words before being transferred to secure containment were almost confused admiration. "You are not like the others." By the time the first week of the war ended, the Empire had achieved none of its primary objectives. They still held orbital superiority, but their fleets were stretched thin, their supply lines fractured, and their commanders forced to respond to human attacks on dozens of simultaneous fronts. What began as a single act of defiance was evolving into a campaign that was rewriting the rules of engagement. Earth had not simply refused to kneel, it had taught the galaxy how to fight standing up. The conflict no longer belonged to Earth alone. Across the mapped territories of the Concorde, unrest spread in waves. What began as isolated defiance became a network of coordinated resistance. Human envoys moved through hidden channels, meeting with leaders of oppressed species, traitors, smugglers, and exiled military officers who had once served the Empire. Every meeting had the same unspoken agreement: no one wanted to replace the Empire, they wanted to end it. Our fleets were still small compared to theirs, but their size was no longer the deciding factor. Supply lines that had once been secure began to collapse under relentless pressure. Orbital drydocs were crippled by sabotage before they could launch repaired vessels. Convoys bound for the Imperial core vanished into silent debris fields where human-engineered traps detonated with surgical precision. Even their most fortified routes could no longer be considered safe. In the agricultural worlds that fed the Empire's population centers, Uprisings broke out not with weapons but with refusal. Workers simply abandoned the harvest, leaving entire shipments to rot under alien suns. The Empire diverted warships to enforce compliance, and in doing so weakened its front lines. Every move they made to suppress one rebellion opened another gap for us to strike. Humans understood that the war would not be won by matching the Empire's firepower but by dismantling its ability to project that firepower. We seeded false intelligence through captured channels, sending fleets on wild chases into uninhabited sectors while our real strikes hit critical infrastructure. We altered their navigational data so that supply craft emerged from faster-than-light travel into asteroid storms or stellar radiation belts. The loss of ships without a single battle was a blow to their pride as much as to their resources. Within the Empire's political hierarchy, fractures deepened. Provincial governors began withholding taxes and tithes, claiming they were needed for local defense. Some worlds openly defied orders to send troops to the front, citing the failure to protect them from pirate raids we had quietly encouraged. Each act of resistance forced the Central Command to stretch itself thinner, shifting fleets from one crisis to another while never regaining the momentum they had at the war's outset. Human technology still could not match theirs in raw capability, but we had learned to turn their sophistication into liability. Their ships required complex maintenance routines that could be disrupted by minor interference. A single infiltrator with the right code could disable targeting systems or corrupt reactor cycles. Their reliance on automated logistics meant that disrupting a handful of control nodes could halt supply chains across dozens of worlds. We did not have to destroy their empire in a single strike, we could make it collapse in sections. The most decisive engagement of this phase did not involve the destruction of a fleet but the breaking of its unity. During what the Empire considered a secure operation to retake a rebellious province, we intercepted and altered communications between two major admirals, convincing each that the other had turned traitor. The resulting mistrust escalated into open fire between their own ships. By the time they realized the deception, the province had secured independence and our forces had withdrawn without a single loss. Yet every success came with a cost. Our crews operated at the edge of exhaustion. Ships went into battle with patched hulls and improvised systems. Losses mounted in every engagement, and for all our victories, there were moments when the price seemed too high. But the alternative, the return to submission, was unthinkable. The Empire still possessed the largest fleet in the galaxy, but it no longer moved as a single entity. Its command structure was fraying, its grip on its subjects loosening. For the first time in living memory, the Concord's authority was not a certainty. The rebellion was no longer a whisper at the edges of their empire. It was a fire spreading toward its heart, and Earth was the one fanning the flames. The Empire's inner territories had once been insulated from conflict, a realm where the Concord's authority was absolute, and the idea of rebellion was treated as an absurdity. That illusion began to disintegrate. Fleets meant to project dominance into the outer rim were now tied up defending systems that had never seen combat in centuries. In the financial core, trade routes that had operated without interruption for generations now faced unpredictable strikes, insurance rates soared, and merchant guilds quietly withheld shipments rather than risk annihilation. In the hard worlds, the first signs of open defiance emerged. These were not poor colonies or remote stations, but wealthy systems with deep ties to the central administration. Their planetary militias refused to deploy beyond their own borders, citing the waste of lives in a war they no longer believed could be won. Some governors opened clandestine negotiations with human envoys seeking guarantees of autonomy should the empire collapse entirely. The Concord's capital tried to mask the growing unrest with grand proclamations of inevitable victory, but the cracks were widening faster than they could be concealed. The phrase that had begun on Earth, refusing to kneel, had transformed into a symbol of resistance across hundreds of worlds. It appeared as graffiti on the walls of imperial garrisons, coded into trade manifests, whispered in marketplaces and work crews. Entire populations were learning that the empire could bleed, that its reach was not infinite. Each act of sabotage, no matter how small, became part of a collective erosion of control. Human forces pressed the advantage with relentless unpredictability. Strike teams appeared deep within enemy territory, crippling manufacturing hubs, erasing command centers, and vanishing before the Concorde could respond. These incursions sowed panic disproportionate to their scale, for they shattered the image of invulnerability that the Empire had cultivated for ages. The knowledge that humans could strike anywhere at any time undermined both the morale of Imperial citizens and the confidence of their military. Facing mounting instability, the Concorde turned to its most destructive weapon, a planetary annihilation platform capable of reducing an inhabited world to lifeless rock. They intended to make Earth the example that would frighten every other species back into compliance. The weapon's transit through hyperspace was detected almost immediately, and every available human ship was committed to stopping it. The engagement that followed was fought in a silent expanse far from any inhabited world, but its outcome would decide the war's future. Our fleets intercepted the platform well before it could reach firing range. The Empire expected us to attempt direct destruction, a tactic that would have been suicidal. Instead, we targeted the escort fleet's coordination systems, isolating the platform from its defenders. The battle became a brutal, close-quarters engagement, with human ships sacrificing themselves to tear through defensive formations. One by one, the platform's shields collapsed under concentrated fire, and a final wave of missile strikes breached its core. The explosion lit the void like a newborn star, scattering debris across thousands of kilometers. News of the weapon's destruction spread faster than the Empire could control. On worlds already simmering with unrest, it was proof that even their deadliest tools could be defeated. On the capital's streets, silent crowds began to gather, and though no one spoke openly of revolt, the fear that had bound the citizenry for generations was weakening. At the same time, a coordinated uprising erupted inside the Imperial home system. Rebels and infiltrators, many trained by human operatives, overran administrative centers, disrupted communication networks, and seized armories. The Concorde's elite guard fought to restore order, but the chaos was too widespread, too coordinated to be contained. The Empire's core was no longer untouchable. The war was no longer at its borders, it had come to its very center. For the first time, those who ruled began to face the possibility that their dominion might not survive, and the thought alone was enough to make them falter. The fall of the Concorde was not marked by a single decisive blow but by a cascade of failures that no amount of authority could reverse. The Imperial fleet that had once stretched across the galaxy was now a patchwork of isolated squadrons, many unwilling to return to the capital's call. Commanders argued over jurisdiction, governors refused orders outright, and worlds once loyal began openly severing ties. In the administrative chambers of the capital, the great banners of the Concorde hung over nearly empty halls, their councils reduced to desperate debates over how much territory could be abandoned without total collapse. Human and allied forces advanced not as conquerors but as dismantlers. Instead of occupying worlds, they dismantled shipyards, erased central surveillance archives, and destroyed or repurposed the infrastructure that allowed the Concorde to maintain control. The objective was not to replace one regime with another, but to ensure the old one could never rise again. Each liberated system was left to choose its own path, whether that meant joining a coalition, standing alone, or rebuilding in isolation. The final act in the war's long progression came when the capital itself was surrounded. The approach had been methodical, cutting supply lines, disabling defensive outposts, and intercepting every fleet attempting to break through. By the time the blockade was complete, the once proud city world was already fracturing under its own weight. Food shortages became riots. The Empire's wealthiest fled on private transports, abandoning the citizens they had ruled over for generations. The assault, when it came, was swift. Coordinated strikes took down orbital defense platforms in minutes, and ground-based command centers were overrun in hours. Resistance was scattered and uncoordinated. Many Imperial soldiers simply laid down their arms, unwilling to fight for leaders who had squandered their loyalty. Within a day, the Concorde's ruling council surrendered, not in a public ceremony, but in a sealed chamber, recorded only in the archives of those who had come to end their reign. No one replaced them. The central government was dissolved. The symbols of the Empire were stripped from its halls and public squares. In their place came the quiet chaos of self-rule. Worlds that had been forced into uniformity for centuries now turned inward, deciding for themselves what they would become. Trade routes shifted, new alliances formed, and some old rivalries reawakened. But none of it was under the shadow of the Concord's command. For Earth, the war's end brought no grand parade. There were no claims of dominion, no expansion of territory, no declaration of a new ruling order. Instead, reconstruction began at home. The fleets that had fought in every corner of the galaxy returned to repair, refit, and mourn their dead. Diplomats and envoys spread outward, not to dictate, but to maintain the fragile trust that had grown among the disparate species who had fought together. The galaxy adapted slowly to the absence of its great power. Some regions descended into conflict as local factions vied for control. Others embraced the freedom, opening new trade and cultural exchange. Yet even in chaos, one truth persisted: the idea that the Concord's will was absolute had been destroyed forever. It had been broken by a single refusal and carried to its end by a coalition that refused to submit. On worlds far from Earth, stories began to take shape. Some were told as fact, others as legend. They spoke of a species that had looked at the most powerful empire in known history and denied it. They spoke of victories won not by sheer force but by stubborn resolve and unrelenting ingenuity. For some, these were rallying cries. For others, they were warnings about the danger of letting such defiance spread. Earth's place in the galaxy was never defined by conquest or control, but by the example it had set. The Concord had fallen, and in its absence, countless futures were possible. Humanity had not claimed the throne, it had burned it, ensuring no one could sit upon it again. And in the echoes of that act, the galaxy learned a truth it would not forget: power is never absolute when even one voice dares to say no.